more modern poets to help remind us that God is still speaking the themes and truths we find in the Psalms. Today's poem is A Litany for Survival by renowned Black lesbian poet Audre Lorde. A Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who are imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Now for our ancient testimony, we'll be reading my favorite psalm, Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and foes, they shall stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, though my heart shall not fear, though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. One thing I asked of the Lord, this I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now my head is lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger, you who have been my help. Do not cast me off. Do not forsake me, O God of my salvation. If my father and mother forsake me, the Lord shall take me up. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Do not give me up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen up against me, and they are breathing out violence. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. The word of the Lord.
Thanks for that.
As far as I understand it, the project for this summer has been sharing our favorite psalms. To me, that task is a bit intimidating because sharing a favorite psalm feels like a vulnerable thing. Psalms are those ancient heart cries we turn to when our own hearts are crying out, when we are overcome by despair, confusion, anger, grief. In a way, sharing my favorite psalm feels a bit like sharing my most gut-wrenching heart cries to God. And I tried to get out of it. I told Pastor Melissa, well, Psalm 27 is my favorite psalm, but I could easily do something else. Of course, she said, Psalm 27 is great. So here I am sharing my favorite psalm with you. Psalm 27 has been my favorite psalm since I was at least 12 years old, if not earlier. It gave me a place to voice fears and anxieties that I didn't know how to process otherwise. I would read and remind myself over and over, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Of course, these questions are meant to be rhetorical. If God is on your side, then who is there to be afraid of? But for me, the fears felt very real. As a child, I had a lot of anxiety. I had your typical garden variety general anxiety disorder, and then on top of that, I had obsessive compulsive disorder, which meant I spent much of every day in a swirl of terrifying thoughts that commanded my existence. One particular way that my OCD manifested was in religious anxiety. I grew up in a very religious evangelical household, which meant that Jesus and the Bible were infused into every part of our life. We did morning devotions, we studied from homeschool curriculums that taught a Christian worldview, we prayed as a family, and we did regular Bible studies, sometimes morning, day, and night. At the time, this seemed to be very life-giving for my parents. For me, though, my little mind was overwhelmed by trying to grapple with the concepts they taught me, like people I loved going to hell, and my own sin making me totally wicked and undeserving of God's love. This theology that was so central to my family's religious beliefs fostered a whole new set of obsessions and compulsions that haunted my everyday life. I felt this tremendous weight of responsibility to evangelize and save all of my non-Christian friends. I was terrified of my own potential for sin, including anything I might not realize was actually a sin and might do accidentally, and thus earn God's wrath and punishment. I feared that any failure might make God reject me. These obsessive thoughts came at me constantly like arrows I had to fend off. If I didn't tell this person about Jesus now, they would surely die and go to hell, and it would be my fault. If I didn't repent for this evil thought immediately, I might go to hell. Perhaps I wasn't really saved at all. But on the outside, I tried to masquerade that everything was fine. On the outside, I was the picture-perfect child of faith, zealous about evangelism, excellent at memorizing Bible verses, a top competitor for kid fastest at looking up and finding Bible references. I was obedient, respectful, excellent at pleasing people, and apparently full of faith, all while on the inside I was terrified. So the Psalms, and particularly Psalm 27, became a place I turned to when I didn't know what to do with my fear and anxiety. I tried to remind myself, God is the stronghold of my life. If God is my foundation, none of these fears can shake me. None of these anxieties can truly separate me from God's love and faithfulness. But I struggled to believe it. Reading the psalm now, I realize the psalmist probably struggled to believe it too. Because while the psalmist starts out by projecting confidence, they quickly describe a situation that sounds absolutely terrifying. They're surrounded by enemies, evil people who are trying to devour the psalmist's flesh. They describe an entire army stationed and encamped around them, as if they're under constant siege, bracing themselves for the next barrage of incoming fire. These enemies witness falsely against the psalmist, telling lies about their faithfulness, their obedience, and promising violent punishment if the psalmist doesn't surrender. While this doesn't sound too dissimilar from the mental battle that is obsessive-compulsive disorder, I imagine it probably isn't metaphorical in the psalmist's case. The psalmist was probably surrounded by actual military or political enemies who want to kill them and gain more power for themselves. In a way, this is the psalmist's own litany for survival. Like in Audre Lorde's poem, the psalmist is constantly looking over their shoulder for danger, imprinted with fear, wondering what kind of good future could possibly come out of this. The psalmist just wants to survive this terrifying experience, to come out on the other side and have good days again, days of peace and joy and freedom from the constant threat of terror and death. And while so much of this psalm sounds confident, God is my light and my salvation. God will hide me in God's shelter on the day of trouble. My enemies will stumble and fall. There are moments when the psalmist's fear and perhaps utter terror break through. Perhaps the moment when this comes through most clearly and painfully is in verse 7, the exact center of the psalm. And in the poetic structure of the Psalms, the verse in the exact center is often the pinnacle, the heart of the psalm's meaning, the most important moment. In this psalm, the pinnacle is when the psalmist breaks character and calls for help. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. It is a bold cry, demanding attention from God. Hidden in the words is the psalmist's admission. They are afraid God might not answer them. God has not saved them yet. The psalmist's plea continues in verses 8 and 9. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. It becomes clear at the heart of the psalm that the psalmist is not speaking of past terrifying experiences and brushes with the enemy. No, the psalmist is terrified here and now and crying out to God, begging for God to answer, begging God to turn and save them. Yet even as they seek God, they fear that God might be hiding God's face from them. They fear deliverance is nowhere to be found. With all the confidence the psalm projects, there is anxiety and terror right under the surface. Yes, on the surface, this is a psalm of confidence. But it is also a psalm about anxiety and fear and life-threatening circumstances from which there seem to be no escape. Perhaps this psalm allows us, and allowed my 12-year-old self, to hold space for our own anxiety. It shows us that we can have faith in God and a good future and still be terrified of the present. It shows us that confidence does not mean banishing anxiety, but simply coming to God with both our faith and our fear. Because the psalmist holds both faith in God and fear of what might happen at the same time. The psalmist is terrified. They are not sure whether God is listening, whether God is there, whether God will come through for them. Yet at the same time, they dare to hope for a new future, imagining the day when they might visit the temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifices and joyful praises to God. Hope and fear coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. The psalmist is not unfaithful because they are afraid. No, their hope in God is even more daring because they are faced with a life-threatening situation. So it is okay if our faith is uttered in the same breath as our fear. If we let down the facade of our doubtless confidence and hold space for our fear too. If you listen closely, you will hear that the psalmist is not just afraid of their enemies. The psalmist is also afraid that God might turn away and abandon them, just when they need God the most. As the psalmist says, do not cast me off, do not forsake me, O God of my salvation. They're trying so hard to do what is right, to have faith, to take courage, to stand strong. But they are afraid they may fail God, and God will reject them. And yet, in the next breath, the psalmist remembers, if my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. Of course, this is the psalm that my anxious soul needed. I was so afraid of not having enough faith, of failing God somehow, of God abandoning me. Yet at the same time, I needed the reminder. Even if everyone else who is supposed to love and support me abandons me, God will not. Because that is who God is. God is the ever-present parent, a shelter in the day of trouble, the stronghold of our lives. God will not abandon the psalmist. God will not abandon us. I needed more than anything to know that God would not abandon me. And I needed a space to talk about my anxieties without being seen as a failure or faithless. It took me a long time to find that space and to find healing from beliefs that harmed me so much. But I have no doubt that this psalm helped me on that journey. The anxieties and dangers that threaten you may feel very different from the mental disorder that threatened me or the violent enemies that threatened the psalmist. Perhaps they feel more like the dangers that Audre Lorde faced as a queer Black woman in a world of racism and homophobia. Perhaps there is a situation in your life that you can't see a way out of that makes it hard to imagine better days ahead. Whatever it is you are facing, I hope this psalm gives you the space it gave me. I hope it reminds you, you are not alone. God will not abandon you. Even as you fear, you can also have faith and hope for a better future. May we remember this when the days of trouble and years of anxiety come. Our faith has space for fear, for terror, for anxiety. None of these feelings will make God turn away from us. And perhaps our fears and anxieties, religious or not, will lose a bit of their power when we are no longer ashamed of them, trying to hide them away as something separate from our faith. If we can see that even the psalmist holds both faith and fear at the same time, perhaps we too can come to God as our whole selves and discover that none of our anxieties will make God turn away. Perhaps we too can speak gently to our anxious souls. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Amen.